Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming on this rainy day. I am Joel Fishman, President of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. It is my privilege, on behalf of the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the University of Southern California Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, and the PDCA, to welcome you here today. With concerns over increasing authoritarianism around the world, we thought it timely to devote today's program to a discussion of what it is like to conduct U.S. public diplomacy in closed societies. Our panelists today directed public diplomacy in Cuba, Russia, and China. I will give brief introductions of our panelists. You can get more fulsome bios on the PDCA website. I think we're in order here. Ben Ziff is a second-generation U.S. Information Agency officer, joining the agency in 1988. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Public Diplomacy, where he established and chaired the Russian Information Group to fight Russian disinformation. He served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Colombia and in Spain, and most recently as Chief of Mission in Cuba before retiring in November 2024. Ben is a recipient of the Department of State's Murrow Award for Excellence in Public Diplomacy and speaks Spanish, Hebrew, and Italian. It doesn't say here he speaks English, but I assume.
Don't take anything for granted.
Michael Hurley, an alumnus of GW, joined USIA in 1985. It served 3 tours in Russia. As PAO Moscow, Michael was the chief architect of a 2-year celebration of culture in the U.S., raising $2 million in the private sector in Russia to create American seasons in Russia. If you want, you can help be a fundraiser for PDCA. Anyway, it culminated in the appearance of the Riccardo Muti and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Hurley retired from the Foreign Service in 2015. In 2017, he was hired as a program officer at Meridian International Center, where he worked until 2019. In 2023, Michael was hired on a 1-year stint with the State Department's Global Engagement Center to counter Russian disinformation. Don Bishop, a former president of the Public Diplomacy Council, one of PDCA's predecessors, joined USIA in 1979. Don served as PAO in numerous posts, including Kabul and, of course, Beijing. Don currently serves on the board of directors of the PDCA Partner Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. The organizer of today's program is PDCA Program Co-Chair Gordon Duguid. Our tech host is Gabby Stahl, who is completing her 2-year tour as PDCA Tom Tuck Graduate Fellow. For those participating online, and we know you're out there, Gabby will be monitoring your questions for the panel in the Q&A box. Please use the chat box only for technical questions, but please do use that Q&A box. The last 2 sessions, you somehow weren't there. You've got to hold up your own. You're competing with the group in this room. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our moderator, Gordon Duguid.
Thank you, Joel. We'll begin with presentations presently, but when we come to the Q&A session, please, if you are able, come to the microphone that stands to my right, your left, to ask your question. We will take 1 question in-house and then a second question online as we proceed. We're going to have, I'm sure, a lively discussion, and so we'll get started straight away with Mr. Ziff, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, PDCA. Great to share the stage with my distinguished colleagues and to see so many friends and former colleagues in the audience. And I will attempt to fit in the entire history of the U.S.-Cuba relationship in 9 to 10 minutes. It is a unique one, and one that I think is misunderstood gravely by anyone who really hasn't been there recently. It's a special case, it really is. Historic ties that go back to the founding of the United States. Both Jefferson and Adams wrote about Cuba, talked about how it should really be part of the United States. It made natural sense. Cuban elites were educated in the U.S. since the 19th century. In fact, William R. King, the 13th Vice President of the United States, took his oath of office in Havana in 1853 because he was dying of tuberculosis and thought it would help him live for 6 more weeks. But the only vice president or presidential candidate who is taking an oath of office outside the United States is in Havana, Cuba. Obviously, we played an important role in the independence of Cuba. Our grandparents honeymooned in Cuba during the first half of the 20th century, and at 90 miles away, it's hard to find a more intimate bilateral relationship than the United States and Cuba, including to this day. The Cuba of imagination, the Cuba of Fidel Castro, the Cuba of the Revolution no longer exists. The Cuba of reality is a very, very different place in some respects. Cuba, when you talk about a closed society versus a controlled society, Cuba is no longer a closed society. It is, however, very much a controlled society. Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution sought to control the thought and behavior of the Cuban people. And for about 30 years, they were able to do so with, block committees and informants and East German style spies and Soviet kind of organizations until the fall of the Soviet Union, in which case the economic situation of Cuba became dramatic, and the control on the private lives of Cubans was lessened. However, that does not mean that control on the public life of Cubans and their engagement with us is any different. Today's Cuba: no free press, no free elections, no freedom of association, no civil society of any significance, unlimited power of the state to harass, sanction, jail, and abuse anyone, limited economic autonomy for Cuban citizens, disastrous economic conditions on the island, weeks without water, island-wide blackouts, no food, no medicine. All of this affects the U.S. Embassy, clearly, because that's where we get our supplies, because there is no way to independently supply food, water, or anything else to the U.S. mission than through the regime. The Cuban government has lost its people and lost the legitimacy of the people, and it's focused on suppressing dissent and shoring up its legitimacy overseas. In fact, 15% of Cuba's population is estimated to have emigrated in the past 4 years. So we're talking about roughly 1 to 1.5 million people have left the island. Of course, the most prepared, the most educated, the most able to survive off the island. So if the Cuban government can no longer control the private thoughts of its or behavior of its population, the focus is on control of public behavior and suppression of dissent. And this has obviously effects on PD programming. The government of Cuba requires official visas for all speakers, for all visitors. So they are able to deny them at will or simply not respond. And that happens frequently. The regime is ultimately is amazingly thin-skinned and sensitive to any kind of criticism. I would get called in to the foreign ministry because of things that appeared on Twitter. And I had to tell the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that, alas, I am not Elon Musk, and I do not control Twitter. There are tight government controls on travel on the island. Only 4 diplomats are able to travel at will anywhere in Cuba. Everyone else has to submit a planilla, an advising form to the Cuban government to be able to leave the limits of Havana province. There are no ancillary partner organizations like in the rest of the world, no Chamber of Commerce, no U.S. companies, no U.S. organizations, no Rotarians, none of our usual partners that exist in most other places exist in Cuba. There is no civil society that is not allowed by the Cuban government. Severe regime domestic information control and a very effective global propaganda machine. If there is a government that appreciates public diplomacy, it's the Cubans. And boy, they're living off it big time, trying to still sell the dream of the revolution worldwide and run around the world rattling their tin cup for donations. It's gone. The revolution, it's done. They control internal information after Fidel's death. It is not clear the decision-making in Cuba, who's running the show, what is going on. It's a very opaque, very Kremlinological kind of who's standing next to who kind of analyses of the regime. Surveillance of me, the embassy personnel, our local staff, all of whom are Cuban government contractors, get called in routinely to be interrogated by the security services, what's going on in the embassy, what's happening. Lots of online surveillance of the population. You want to go to jail quick, go on Facebook and say something nasty about the Cuban government, and you will see the inside of a cell. Threats to our program participants and to our grant recipients. Before I left Cuba just late last year, we had people who felt they had to leave the island because of the threats they were facing from the Cuban government. They would get visits from the security services and who would be advised that, would you like to go to jail or would you like to drive an Uber in Miami? And many of them chose Miami for obvious reasons. And finally, there isn't really no private venue in Cuba that can host us. So a restaurant, a bar, a home that would host a PD event would be visited also by the Cuban security services and said, do you really want to be engaged with the American government? Lots of focus on the public diplomacy section. Lots of, we have to hire our local staff through the Cuban government. They would deny 9 out of 10 applications of people we wanted to hire for the PD section. For other sections, it was a lot easier to hire, but they knew that the PD section was going to be important. Government threats to embassy supplies and operations, fuel, water, et cetera. They can turn it off anytime they want. And finally, and this is something I think many of you will appreciate, multiple complicated audiences and stakeholders to what is happening in Cuba. The Cuban government, the Cuban people, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. exile community, Cuban-American exile community, the White House, the State Department, foreign governments, all react swiftly and loudly to whatever the U.S. government is doing in Cuba. But nonetheless, there are tremendous opportunities in Cuba, and this is what was paradoxical. We are the ring, we are the precious for Cuba to this day. We are it for the Cuban people, unquestionably. For 30 years, the Russians were running around in Cuba. You don't see people wearing Russian flags on their shirts or having Russian basketball jerseys. It's all Kobe Bryant. It's all American flags. It is us. So the Cuban people have no other reference point than the United States. No Cuban believes in the revolutionary ideology anymore, and nor expects anything really from the Cuban regime. And frankly, significant Cuban-American engagement with the island brings news, ideas, and sustenance to many of the population there. You wouldn't believe it, given what you would think about Cuba. There are 150 weekly flights to Cuba from the United States. 2.5 million Cuban Americans who care very deeply what's going on the island. Cuba today is much more permeable to outside information, travel, and influence than ever before. The internet, our phones, most Cubans have a smartphone and they know how to use VPNs, and the world is open before them. So the government no longer is able to censor effectively the outside world to the Cuban government. Less of a need for us to inform, like in the past. Now our role really is to inspire and to support. Zoom clearly allows direct access to Cuban individuals without going through any government or any physical presence on the island. And the world is increasingly aware of a Cuban repression, and we have more allies in Europe and elsewhere to try and change the Cuban government's behavior toward its own population. Now, what were the PD goals when I was in Cuba? About 4 of them. Number 1, supporting the democratic aspirations of the Cuban people, messaging and informing them of their own rights under the Cuban Constitution. In fact, the Cuban Constitution has some of the similar rights to our Constitution. They're just not effectively applied. So we told the Cubans that, no, actually, your Constitution gives you the right of free speech, free assembly. What a shame that your government doesn't allow you to do that. We name and shame anti-democratic actions by individuals in the Cuban regime. Many of them are already sanctioned under Magnitsky and others. And so we inform Cubans of that directly. We advocate for the protection of human rights. We meet with the human rights defenders directly. There wasn't a meeting with the Cuban government that I did not discuss either individual cases or the repression of human rights. and we highlight to the world systemic violations of the human rights in Cuba. In a novel way, since the Cuban government very much dominates economic activity on the island, we tried to support the incipient economic actor class with know-how and networking, not a big MBA program at Havana University, you can imagine. So we advocate for economic independence from the Cuban government. How do you open a business? How do you write a business plan, et cetera? We disincentivized irregular migration. It was a big problem. Over the past 5 years, we had hundreds of Cubans arriving at the southern border every day. 97% of those were admitted to the United States, taking very dangerous journeys through Central America, through Managua and north. So we were trying to educate them about legal pathways, and why do you want to disappear at sea and your family wondering what happened to you. Let me conclude with some of the lessons we learned that I don't think will be novel to most of you. To me, it was novel that Cuba was the most pro-American country in which I've ever served. Of the dozen places I've ever been, nary a bad word was ever said to me about the United States, except in the most official of contexts, and that was never really meant. It was kind of rote. We're it. So the door is open for us to deal with Cuba directly if we're allowed to do so. Paying attention matters. Be present. Cubans need us to care and need to be seen that we care about Cuba. Need to balance Washington and local messaging. Sometimes, you all know this from your activities. Washington messaging is kind of not necessarily curated for a local audience, and Cuba is a very, very local audience. In-house video, audio, and social media is essential. You have to be able to do that now yourselves. Use USG venues that cannot be shut down by the government. In other words, my house, the CMR, or the embassy itself, because any bar or restaurant could be shut down. Swim downstream. See what pragmatic programming resonates with your audience. How-to speakers. What is it that we can teach or show or describe that aligns with what people want to see? How do you filter water? How do you build a chicken coop? Whatever it might be. These are things that allow us to engage via things that people care about. Be funny. God, we're so serious generally, and when we talk about to our foreign audiences. Cubans have a great sense of humor. We curated messages and programming to local conditions, used local symbols. It's amazing what kind of resonance you get with that. Look for sort of programming that does a number of things at the same time. For example, we would bring U.S. artists when we were allowed to do, not just for the artistic component, but because these are people. How do you monetize your art? How do you monetize your dance? You're a musician. How do you make money? How do you make this a business? And that is something that we were able to do pretty effectively to try and, again, remove people from dependence on the state. Pay attention to the political winds. Anticipate the potential personal institutional retaliation by the regime. Evaluate if the juice is worth the squeeze, because the government's going to respond. You need to know how they're going to do it. Finally, in Cuba, you got to be patient. Even if the regime never changes, conditions and circumstances do. We need to be prepared to take advantage. And I think that public diplomacy is certainly one of those areas that allows us to do it best. So with that, let me turn it over to my partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. And Mr. Bishop.
I had warmed up for my assignments to China in earlier tours in Hong Kong and Taipei. I became Deputy Public Affairs Officer in Beijing from 1997-2000, and with Nigeria in between, I was PAO from 2003 to 2006. Now, both my tours came 2 decades after the reform and opening proclaimed by Deng Xiaoping in 1978. We called it engagement. But for the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, it was hide your strength, bide your time. During that period of engagement, American businesses established joint ventures, AmCham thrived, sister relationships between Chinese and American cities and universities abounded. Thousands of young Americans were studying Chinese at their universities, working for joint ventures or Chinese companies, and teaching English, even in China's remote areas. FCS and FAS had full agendas. U.S. government departments and agencies as diverse as the Federal Aviation Administration Centers for Disease Control, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and the Coast Guard worked with their Chinese counterparts. And public diplomacy was fully engaged. The steady visits of administration principals, especially the 9-day visit by President Clinton and several visits by President Bush, kept the information unit busy with press conferences, media availabilities, and background briefing. At the embassy, we programmed speakers at universities and policy institutes. We sent international visitors, nearly all on tailored individual programs with escort interpreters, and American and Chinese Fulbrighters studied and researched both ways. The number of Chinese students studying in the US multiplied. We published a one-country magazine, Zhao Liu. We supported conferences by China's American Studies Association. Justice Anthony Kennedy twice visited law schools. The Minnesota Bar organized moot courts. With China's top law school, we sponsored the translations of American law textbooks from English to Chinese. So this was soft power in action. There was a lot going on, but China had levers to assure it would continue as a denied society, as a controlled society. So there were always boundaries on our programs.
We need to lean into this.
Lean in.
Lean into this.
Leaning in. Okay. No Chinese partner would co-sponsor a program on human rights, but we could program on rule of law. Here's another. This was the time of Chinese tyrannical one-child policy. No program that questioned it would be allowed. We knew any discussion of the 3 Ts, Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen, would provoke an aggressive Chinese response. And all of this stemmed from China's political organization. China's a nation, but it's a different kind of nation, a party state. The Soviet Union, its satellites, North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, Eritrea, Ba'athist regimes in the Middle East, Saddam's Iraq, these are or were party states. In party states, a single party proclaims itself a vanguard that will lead the people toward bright futures. Whatever their constitutions may say, the party has a monopoly on power. There is hardly what we would call civil society. Party states have carrots and sticks to sustain their rule. Politics, as we think of it, occurs only inside the party. And this favors big men, internecine struggles within the party, corruption, conformity, and whole peoples deformed by limits on speech and thought. In other words, denied their full humanity. Party states suppress dissent with visions, gulags, re-education camps, threats, or roving abortion bans. They have their own newspapers, radio, and television, instruct media what is licit or illicit to report or discuss, and propagandize and indoctrinate their populations. They want to insulate their people from foreign, meaning free, information. Radio jamming was once a method. Now they police and sometimes block the internet. And interestingly, China has never allowed Rotary or Alliance to be organized in China. For public diplomacy in China, the organizations that implemented the Communist Party's policies and placed the boundaries on our programs were foreign affairs offices, WIBON, in every university, think tank, company, organization, or city. China's universities know that visits by foreign scholars, diplomats, or speakers can enrich the experience of their faculties and students, but they guard the gates against any discussion of forbidden concepts. This could require careful wordsmithing on our part. There were permissions and there were refusals. And if we were invited to discuss one subject, spoke of something else, something sensitive during the program, it could be many months before we would ever be invited back. Visits by high-level administration principals could break through some of this control. There were always press conferences or availabilities during their visits, duly attended by both the Chinese and international press. By local convention, the first question was always asked by the People's Daily. That flagship party newspaper would print a story. No matter what the speaker had said, they would print a story that conformed to the party's line, and the Xinhua news agency would report it the same way. Usually the international press at the same conferences would ask good questions and report the news to international audiences. But if the answers did not conform to what the party wanted reported, they were not reported in China. A few examples. After hard negotiations, President Reagan was allowed to speak directly to the Chinese people by radio, but with no previous announcement on a Shanghai local station during an afternoon, a weekday afternoon when listenership was low, with no translation into Chinese. I admired how President Bush and Secretary Rice always attended a Chinese church service on Sunday, but their visits were untold in China. I was with former President Carter at Beijing University during a Q&A with students. In his mild way, he witnessed for Christ, but only those students in the room heard his testimony. Ambassador Rant never gave a speech without mentioning human rights cases, but his concerns were never in the media. There are 3 tiered party reference publications to circulate foreign news articles to restricted readerships. I would occasionally see a copy of the lowest level reference news. Its coverage of news was spotty, and translations of opinion pieces were rare. Even this intra-party intelligence bulletin would not contravene the party's censorship of foreign news. Well, you do what you can. When Peter Kovacs, Gerald Jenks, and I made our first visit to Xinjiang, the province's Weiban scheduled our visit carefully, seeing mostly Han Xinjiang rather than Uyghur Xinjiang. I prepared to speak positively of U.S.-China engagement in areas like aviation and mining safety. But the only real discussion was at a roundtable between us and staffers from several local foreign affairs offices. After we finished, the Weiban chief told us, "We've never been aware of these cooperation before." Though our visit had virtually no reach, it was a small but necessary step toward opening the door more widely to something in the future, we hope. At that time, it was difficult for any embassy personnel to visit Tibet, but I received permission to join an official from the consulate in Chengdu, Tibet being in the Chengdu consular district. I saw the Budala and the sites of Lhasa and was hosted for dinner, but the only meeting I had was with their foreign affairs office. They saw no value in receiving English teaching materials. Looking back, I would judge that public diplomacy exchanges and promotion of study in the U.S. were the more valuable PD programs. That subnational exchanges with cities and universities had great potential, but the Chinese took advantage of the American participants' lack of background on China. And by focusing on developing relations with law schools, we enlarged the thinking of China's legal community. This period of U.S. engagement with China took its lead from President Clinton's belief that economic progress would help China become a responsible stakeholder in the international system, and it would favor China's liberalism and political development. That was surely dashed in the party's 2012 document number 9, which defines 7 threats. Neoliberalism, meaning economic liberalization, privatization, and marketization. Historical nihilism, undermining the history of the Chinese Communist Party and questioning reform and opening. The West's idea of journalism, Western constitutional democracy, civil society, and liberal values too. 2, the party regarded the 2019 demonstrations in Hong Kong as covertly supported by the United States. Looking back, I was PAO during the glory days of engagement. Now the signs are adverse. The number of American students in China has shrunk to a few hundred. Young Americans no longer think of working in China to launch their careers. China's Great Firewall has restricted access to the internet. All internet accounts are registered to a documented individual owner, so any wayward thought, they can come and find the person who expressed it. I understand my successors as PAO face many more restrictions. Foreign affairs offices, once only carefully obstructionist, now reject outreach from the embassy and consulates. Programs are only conducted on our spaces at the embassy and consulates. We offer IVs, but few agree to travel. That said, on our part, we terminated the Fulbright program. And I worry about weakening U.S. government broadcasting in China. The Chinese know better than we do that elements of national power are as much informational as well as military, diplomatic, and economic. They are deploying informational power, soft power, sharp power, while we neglect and sometimes diminish it. Where we withdraw, they enter. China's leadership is more and more explicit about ending American leadership in the world, and our neglect needs to end.
And Mr. Hurley.
Right. Talk fast. Okay, personal history. Just 2 words on personal history, because the extent of the time that I spent in the Soviet Union and Russia is started in 1972 with a language course in Leningrad. In the 80s, I was the 70s, I'm sorry, I was an exhibits guide for U.S. Information Agency. In the 80s, I went to the embassy for the first time, also in the 90s and the 2000s. More recently, in 2023, I went back to the State Department and worked for a year, almost a year, with the Global Engagement Center countering Russian disinformation. I decided to divide this topic into 2 parts. One is restrictions, the things we had to put up with in doing public diplomacy, and the other one is workarounds. Among the restrictions, food. Food in the Soviet Union was difficult. Fruit and vegetables were difficult to get in the winter. Travel was restricted, as with my colleagues' countries. We had to go through the foreign ministry to go outside of Moscow. And then with an agency called Intourist, which of course was a KGB-run outfit. In student days, we had minders. We had people assigned to us to keep track of us. In the exhibits program, the exhibits travel around all over the Soviet Union. We had, in the 70s, we had agitators, people who would come in and ask purposely embarrassing questions. Why do people get out of garbage cans in the United States? And why do you hate black people? And why, on and on and on. Made it very difficult to do this in Russian with a few hundred people standing in front of you in a room, maybe half this size. Politics, of course, entered in. We had the 1980 Olympics, which we boycotted, in 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, which they boycotted, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. We had the radios. We had Voice of America and Radio Liberty, which were jammed, but the Russians were pretty clever at finding things like Willis Conover's Music USA from 1955 to 1996. In IV program selections, we would put forward a candidate in a ministry, let's say, and the minister would come back to us and say, well, yes, Ivan Ivanov is a great guy, but we've got the head of a section over here who's barely breathing, but a true loyal Communist Party member. And so we took some of the good with the bad that way. In the 70s, work with news organizations was very restricted. They just weren't interested. But I'll come back to that topic because we had a big victory during Gorbachev years. The foreign agent law started in 2012. Any kind of foreign participation, meaning funds to Russian NGOs, or ultimately the U.S. NGOs such as Peace Corps were just sort of run out of the country. And those Russians who were accepting funds from USAID and all the other organizations were labeled foreign agents. We had America Magazine, a one-country magazine that was restricted to 50,000 copies in Soviet times, that went to 200,000 in Russia. In the Chancery, of course, the famous problem with the building and the bugs that stopped construction in 1985, did reopen in 2000 with Madeleine Albright. There were personal security issues. I was there to witness two attempts to launch a grenade from a, whatever it is, rocket propelled grenade at the embassy, both misfired, separate incidents. There were three fires, 1977, 91, and 2001, that burned basically the top of the old Chancery building. There were the few problem was people having a little bit too much party coming over the walls and doing various things. One of them was caught in the DCM's shower, which was kind of interesting.
Alone?
Alone. Right.
By the DCM?
I don't know. I wasn't there. Of course, surveillance. The Russians, I think, invented the method of absorbing sounds from the vibration of windows in the residences. KGB came through even the compound apartments. The FSNs, the LES folks regularly reported into the security forces on the Russian side. And then we had the Clayton Lone Tree in 1986. So really, in the end, it was a very heavy experience. I mean, it was just, you always felt like, God, there's food and there's travel and there's spies, and it's just. So what were the workarounds? Workarounds in January 1958, the US and USSR signed a cultural, scientific, and technical agreement that opened the way for all manner of exchanges with student and cultural exchanges, and probably the IV program, not quite sure where that comes in. In the exhibits, we had 19 exhibits, starting with 1959 in Moscow, where the famous Nixon-Khrushchev debate took place, the kitchen debate, and ending in 1991, when the Soviet Union ended. 250,000 people per city came through the exhibit. And we estimate that 20 million Soviets over 32 years saw these exhibits. The breakthrough on the media side came in the Gorbachev years, when my little footnote to history, I was assigned by the press attaché, I was an AIO, an assistant information officer, I was assigned to go to Izvestia, the government newspaper, sort of the paper of record, to try to get them to place an article by Max Kampelman, the chief arms control negotiator. And so I met with the deputy editor, Mr. Yefimov, and he didn't like the idea at first, to say the least. But eventually, through a series of, this was the Glasnost era, 1987. And they published it finally on August 26, 1987, but could not resist putting in a paragraph. So they had the Kampelman article and then Mikheyev, who was a Soviet negotiator, and to give the two positions on arms control. In the middle, I have this on my wall at home, of course, from Izvestia. There's a paragraph on how the embassy insisted that we do this and publish this article, and we agreed reluctantly, even though Izvestia has 10,000 or 100,000 subscribers, and the New York Times, where they had published things, has only 10,000. They didn't go into the various uses of Izvestia on the bottom of bird cages and things like that. But it was a real breakthrough in the Glasnost area. We had the radios; they were jammed, but Russians were pretty, as I said, were pretty clever at figuring out how to get around that. And one of the things that worked to our advantage was, since the Soviet Union and Russia were so very isolated from other sources of information, there was a real thirst for information. And this is why we had 250,000 people over roughly 20 days for each city that we were in with the exhibit. Another one that came a bit later, called American Seasons in Russia. That's what this book is about, which was basically a 2-year celebration of culture in the United States. it played all over the Soviet Union. The centerpiece, as somebody noted already, was the Chicago Symphony with Riccardo Muti, which is a wonderful event. Um, and just to finish up then, in-country travel was possible. I was an exhibit guy, but then when I first tour in the embassy, I went out in advance of the exhibit to see if Khabarovsk or Vladivostok, Samara or whatever it might be, were appropriate. So it had to be appropriate facilities to host an exhibit. And in doing that, I was able to interview all kinds of people. I went to the mayor's office and heard them complain about, well, if we just were able to keep our resources from Moscow, we'd be prosperous, but they keep taking them away. So just last word, what was the difference between how we were received in Soviet times and Russian times? In the Soviet period, after we concluded the cultural agreement in the 50s, the Russians were very interested in showing us their wares. This is what we do. We have scientists, and we go into outer space and all that sort of thing. And Russia today, they're not, and that's a huge difference. They don't care. So I'll just leave it there.
Hey, what are questions, very quickly? Two things stand out for me from the discussion. One is that all of the efforts described here take place over generation. Efforts in PD are long-term and do not easily fit into somebody's accounting system. And that is one of the weaknesses that we face in defending this program. But one of the things that came out for me that shows we should make that defense is that every authoritarian dictatorship in the world understands the power of public diplomacy, and they fight like hell to stop us. So with that, first question. Questions, please go up to the circle. I see Joel has started.
I am standing in the circle just as instructed.
You squared the circle, okay.
I have a question for Ben. Given the permeability of Cuba's media borders, how critical is the continuation of the Martis, and what effect do their demise have?
Well, I think they have actually been recalled. Radio Marti has come back from the dead and is now, I think, returning to the airwaves. So Radio Marti is, I think, back on the air, if I'm not mistaken, as of a couple of weeks ago. I think it's important in a couple of ways. People want to know that the U.S. is making an effort on their behalf. And regardless of the content of Radio Marti, it is highly symbolic of something that the U.S. government is trying to do on behalf of the Cuban people. So while I'm not sure that that people necessarily need Marti anymore because they have the internet and other sources of information, I think it's important that it remain on the air for those who do listen, and also as a symbol of our commitment to the future of the Cuban people.
And thank you. And not to play favorites, Don and Michael, if you want to comment on USAGM instruments, and we don't know what's going to happen yet, but what effect would the demise have?
Well, I'm certainly a believer in U.S. Uncle Sam's international broadcasting, and as I think I said, I'm anxious that it be not be weakened. There are the questions of independence, the journalism. I've never met a BOA person who said we're part of public diplomacy. They say we're part of journalism. So anyway, it just strikes me as there hasn't been broadcasting and public diplomacy as we know it has never really been knit together. And this is my entire career since 1979 when I came in. So it's, anyway, it's important. And anyway, I hope it continues.
Yeah, similarly with Russia, I mean, the Russians now who want to get information about the outer world, outside world have either left or they can get it in the big cities. Where I think it will be missed is in the rural areas where people still have shortwave radios and they could still tune into these things and get some information, some entertainment.
Kathy.
Yeah, hi. So I have a question from the online audience, and I think this is a good follow-up. It's from our board member, Larry Schwartz. He said, thank you so much for being here, and he said that he couldn't be in person. Given the realities of our current government policies, what priority strategies or tools would you suggest in addressing these audiences? Either prioritizing mass communications, radio, or social media, or returning to retail people-to-people outreach?
Yeah, no, people to people obviously is important, but very difficult in Russia. I have not been there since 2012, so I'm a little bit out of touch. But one thing that's clear is we lost 3 consulates in Vladivostok, Yekaterinburg, and Petersburg. So we have much less ability to understand what's going on inside the country. We had 56 American corners, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. We now have none. We did have a center in Moscow, which is now virtual, and they do what they can, but it's just very limited.
Well, I'm persuaded by my own experience. I came into USIA or even before that into Air Force Public Affairs in the time of newspapers, wire services, deadlines, magazines.
Wireless
op-eds.
file.
Well, with a wireless file. Oh, don't get me started. So, and the entire communications environment of nearly the whole world has changed to emphasize social media. Now, reports I hear, is that every information officer at every embassy spends his whole morning with the ambassador's tweet, which has to be approved by every section of the embassy. So it loses spontaneity and it loses time. Whereas social media has immediate impact. So I'd say that now social media environments are different all over. But in general, I'd say that there needs to be a shift, and this is mainly among the young people who know how to do it, toward more social media communication of key ideas. And then I have one. I've always had these odd ideas. In my experience,
Why we love you.
at many embassies, the information officer traditionally, of course, now there's the new PD staffing initiative, but the information of the press officer is not always the person who speaks the language best, is not colloquial enough. And so I always thought that every mission should find that young foreign service officer who absolutely has the best language. And then that person becomes the face of the embassy and can do the media interviews, the little lighthearted things.
Morning shows.
Yeah, so the whole, I started learning Chinese when I was 34. It was too late. So we need, and one of the problems with the reduction of the number of American students studying in China is we don't have a rising generation of young people who, by spending a year or perhaps 2 years on a Chinese campus away from the capital and away from other foreigners, really get the lingo. And we rely instead on somebody who's been to sent to FSI at age 40. So anyway, this is, anyway, yeah. we need
Radical
better
stuff indeed.
Communication, more colloquial and younger communication on social media.
Every one of my ambassadors thought he or she was the face again.
Well, okay, that's a doctrinal
a-
question
yeah.
to settle. Yeah.
Okay, Ben.
I'd take our entire budget and put it into ECA exchanges. I think that, throughout my career, I always told people who would come up to me and tell me about the United States, I would say, so have you been there? No, but I watch TV. I watch MTV. It's like, well, you know what? You go, you spend some time there, come back, love us, hate us, that's fine. But at least you know us. And I'm pretty confident in this country and our society that if you come here and spend time here, it will pay off for us. And it doesn't, coming here as for a month or a Fulbright or a Y-Lie program or whatever, that beats a tweet any day, in my view. And even if they leave and they loathe everything about us, which is unlikely, at least they have a basis to understand.
We
So
want them
that's
to
my-
hate us for the right reasons.
Well, or they hate me for the right reasons. That's more like it.
Thank you.
But if you think about U.S.-China relations, there are, I think, it's down some, but there are 250,000 Chinese studying in the United States, undergraduates, graduate students, and surprisingly at American prep schools. And so they do get to know the United States in numbers that far exceed any kind of formal exchanges or.
And that will pay off. I think
yeah,
that will pay off.
So anyway, that's always needs to be reinvigorated.
Thank you. Next question, please introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, my name is Carlos Wild Gladbach. So my question, sorry, is how did U.S. politics, kind of like in particular, their views on like news outlets, like our current president has, how does that or did that affect your job?
Just very quickly to say that, of course, we're all sworn to defend the Constitution, but I found as a public diplomacy officer that my job was not so much to advocate for gun control or abortion or whatever these topics that have no gray area, but rather to explain the context for, why is it that Americans love their guns, or why is it that, this or that religious factor. And that followed me throughout my career.
As a police officer, I think what affected us in the field was when American leadership would make statements that were aimed at a domestic audience and gave us no, room to interpret it for a local audience, where it would be seen in very stark terms wherever you might be serving, even though it might have made sense in the U.S. This is where the context comes in, but you found yourself having to pedal very quickly to try and explain, for example, former President Bush's reference to crusaders. That was.
So, yeah, public diplomacy is always affected by new administrations. And it's also affected by social movements in the United States, because even though foreign service officers are always muted in their discussion of controversial issues in the United States, you get asked questions. And so I always told the young officers that when in doubt, explain. Now, you might be pro-life or you might be pro-choice, but it's not right for you to stand out and for one or the other. And you can say, well, we're having a debate on that in the United States. And well, on one side, they point to this, and on the other side, they point to that. And we'll both follow the debate as it unfolds. So having the ability to just explain explain what's going on in the United States really calms people down. And you widen their aperture because they may have heard about the issue from one point of view or the other point of view. So, and that goes, so I used one hot button issue, but it applies to all kinds of.
Well, thanks very much. If I could remind our panelists, please love your mic, pull it in to you, and our online audience is all, they're all got their ear to the computer.
Yeah, and I think as my colleagues say, one of the advantages in, particularly in our societies, is if something pops up in the news that is hot button or provokes a reaction, you turn to your interlocutor and say, wouldn't it be great if that could happen here? Wouldn't it be great if your media could talk to say those kind of things, or you could have the kind of free exchange that is evident, even if you disagree with it? Wouldn't that be wonderful to have happen here, right? And that kind of immediately turns the conversation in a different direction.
Online question, Gabby, and then we'll go to Bill. I see Bill.
Yeah, so someone asked, and kind of following up to what we talked about earlier, and I think Ben mentioned it, how do you work and manage local employees when they're either provided by the host government or, vetted and monitored by their host government? How does that work?
We're all three of us, right, in the same boat.
Yeah.
They had to work through
Yeah.
an organization that belonged to the
I'll
other.
do it. I went to Cuba worried about this. I thought, oh my God, we're going to get stuck with people who are going to be, work to rule, their sticks in the spokes of the U.S. government. They're going to try and sabotage our efforts, yada, yada, yada. In fact, I found outstanding local employees who, while they may not be, supremely trained because they haven't had the opportunity, these are people who wanted to work for us and understood what they were doing when they came in to work for us, and the sort of the threats they and their family would face, the harassment and everything else. And it was our job to make sure they didn't know what they weren't supposed to know. And my instruction to my local staff was, when you get called in, you tell them everything everything possible, because it is my job to make sure that you are, there's nothing that that you cannot tell. And so you go ahead, and that calmed the waters down a lot in terms of our staff worried about, like, what do I say? Will I be fired if I get called into the security service? No, we understand. We understand this is we appreciate your sacrifice for coming to work for us. I really found very few instances of our local staff, we paid a lot of attention to this, doing anything except being very loyal embassy functionaries for us. And so I thought I was very blessed with an outstanding local staff in Cuba, much to my surprise.
I think the main thing is to look for competence. Are they doing the job? In my 3 tours in Moscow, there were several LESs who were asked to leave the embassy because they were caught doing things with bribery or too obviously reporting or going through documents that they had no business looking at. But it was really, if you sort of have that in mind, what you're looking for is for them to do a good job, do as good a job, do the job they were assigned, and then to do it as well as they can. And that was generally the result.
All right, Mr. Juan.
Thanks, Gordon. You three obviously did very respectable jobs in your generation. Those are the old days. That was like 2024. Those are the old days. To the extent you're able to keep up with media events in those countries you served in, how is the new administration being received?
How is the what? How is my case rather well? Just now.
Chinese media or the Cuban media?
Well, the Chinese media are, as I said, they will all reflect government themes, and they will react to statements, civilian or government, that rub up against or attack their positions. At the same time, they do want to keep, they want to keep some channels open to be able to discuss things. And ultimately perhaps to negotiate about tariffs. But I'm not so close to it anymore, but when I read now with machine translations, you can read way deep into party documents and speeches by Xi Jinping and ring out meanings. And right now, things are not so friendly. And it comes from Xi Jinping among party leaders is really what in the old days would be called red. Believes in the leadership of the Communist Party. It's part of his personal history, his family history. He was sent down youth in the countryside, but instead of resenting it, he integrated it into his experience. So he's, in Chinese circles, everybody listens to what he has to say. And the party is 20 million people. And it's a pretty large percentage of China's population. And I remember talking to one of the FSNs who was I said, "Are you a member of the party?" She said, "Oh, no, so many meetings." And actually you go to the party websites and see the meetings. They drag in all the assistant directors and the people, and they sit at a long table, and a rather stern party member, got the text of the latest speech, and they go over it painstakingly.
Sounds like country team.
No. So very fun.
Thanks, Don.
Okay. Anyway, so that they have control, the leadership is indoctrinated.
Ben, anything to add?
Well, I mean, Cuba, the talking points for the United States are like one page and they really haven't changed a lot. So it's like, you guys are SOBs or, you're a little bit less SOBs than you were in the past but you're still SOBs. So the Cuban regime really doesn't change its tune very much, again, to us. And, having this administration, they already had experience with this administration, one administration ago. So it's back to the future again in Cuba. And, one of the big frustrations of dealing with Cuba is that unchanging nature. It's almost, I always call it a religion. It's like when you ask the Cuban regime to change, its modality, they say, well, it's like, changing a religion. This is, people live and breathe this. They fought for this. They think that this is the way forward. In fact, their identity is so enmeshed with the confrontation with the United States that their reaction to whatever administration comes in is pretty much the same.
Thank you. Thank you. We are galloping away with the clock here. So last question, I'm afraid.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for speaking with us. My name is Amanda Spincola. I'm a student affiliate at the East West Center in Honolulu. I study China.
Nice.
And my question is about surveillance of ordinary citizens in the countries in which you spoke about this afternoon. Now, as a representative of the United States, if you were to be arrested by the KGB and thrown in a gulag, we would be able to get you out. However, ordinary citizens in this country do not have that protection. And when organizing public diplomacy events and talks at your embassies, because as you mentioned, and given the surveillance state, you don't have third-party spaces you can host these events at. Hosting events at the embassy, how do you ensure that ordinary citizens will not be arrested or retroactively harmed just purely by going to these events, even if they don't speak publicly any dissent against the regime?
Tough question.
Don.
So China's famous, as you say, for now, the modern surveillance state. It's not just being able to read your cell phone, it's all the cameras at Tiananmen Square and everywhere, and facial recognition technology so that they can identify where people go. Now, my experience isn't in this modern hyper state. If there's an invitation to an embassy event, and usually they're by invitation, not sort of broadcast on the radio that anybody can come and listen to this. So people, they come. They made themselves make the decision to come. And I suppose there's a second layer though, and that is that, okay, so the American speaker speaks or the ambassador speaks or whatever. And there are going to be in the audience some surveillance people, and they'll know who asked the questions. Just sitting there quietly is not going to raise concern like if you get up and ask a question that might be interpreted as anti-China somehow. So having said that, I'd say we need to ask somebody with more recent experience.
I think it's very difficult to protect other people's citizens in their own country. However, we could do a better job in this country of protecting Chinese students from China's extraterritorial policing of their activities and their speech here in our own country. And with that, I'll get off my soapbox. Joel.
Yeah. Ben, Don, and Michael, we want to thank you very much for this. We have a little token of appreciation. How do you want to handle this?
A new car.
Yes. Cash and fabulous prices are yours.
Can you go behind him maybe?
I'll go behind, okay.
Oh, my.
Kind of lazy.
Oh,
All right. You serve from the left.
I serve from the left.
Yes.
Thank you.
oh, an honor.
This is-
God.
Yes, indeed. They are substantial coasters. Thank you.
Very nice. Well, it doesn't come up with the
Wow.
glass.
Forms to the limit.
Yeah, I was gonna
Actually
say,
super useful because my HHE.
but it's heavy enough so it doesn't stick up with the glass.
Are your grandfather's sisters.
Thank you very much.
And before we close, I have to bring you the bad news that Illinois State University is stealing Gordon Duguid from us.
Oh,
Gordon will be the next Donald F. McHenry Visiting Professor in Diplomacy and International Affairs at the university's Department of Politics and Government. Gordon will commence his 2-year tenure spanning the 2025-26 and 2026-27 academic years in August. Until then, Gordon, you are ours.
Thank you.
But here's a little token for your desk in Normal, Illinois.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
there's an irony there.
Well, here, yeah, let's.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Actually, can I get, we done? I'm gonna get the.
No, we're not done.
We're not done.
I'm taking over.
Oh, wait, there's more.
I have to get out of
Always
the
the
way and
photographer.
give the mic to Gordon.
Okay, and we now will close. Our next first Monday program is May the 5th, when we will discuss the efforts by Canada and Mexico to conduct public diplomacy in the United States. It'll be an academic discussion. We have lined up Evan Potter of the University of Ottawa and Cesar Villanueva of the Ibero-Americana organization in Mexico City. We'll be here. Please follow our website and newsletter for details of timing and what venue. With that, I thank you all, and we'll talk to you next month.